The groaning started somewhere past the second-mile marker. Paul Travers stopped walking. He held the lantern out at arm's length and let the flame steady itself. The tunnel walls were wet. The air smelled of sulfur and standing water and something underneath both of those things that he could not name. He had been in tunnels before. He had been underground at Shiloh, in the rifle pits along the sunken road where men lay stacked 3 deep and the living fired over the bodies of the dead. He knew what fear tasted like. Copper in the mouth, a tightening at the base of the skull. This was different. The groaning came again. It did not echo the way sound should echo in a stone bore nearly 5 miles long. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves, from the pooled water around his boots, from the dark ahead and the dark behind. Travers held still. He was a cavalry officer. He had ridden through cannon smoke at a full gallop. He did not believe in ghosts. He wrote to his sister 3 days later. The letter, dated 1872, contained a single line about the experience that researchers would later circle in pencil and pass between themselves for decades. He told her he had not been that frightened since the Battle of Shiloh. He did not describe what he heard after the groaning stopped. He did not explain why he turned back. The letter moved on to other subjects: the weather, a horse he was considering buying, as if the paragraph before it had not existed at all. That letter was found in a private collection in western Massachusetts. It was not the only account from inside that tunnel. It was not even the strangest. My name is Joel. I find old accounts of things that happened to working people in dangerous places, things that were left out of official records and never spoken of again. If you've got a story of your own, the link to submit it is in the description. And if you want more of these, subscribing is the best way to make that happen. Between 1865 and the early 1970s, workers, engineers, investigators, and at least one sitting president encountered something along stretches of rail infrastructure in the northeastern United States that nobody could adequately explain. The encounters were not confined to one tunnel or one stretch of track. They occurred in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina. They were reported by men with no connection to one another, separated by decades, working for different railroads in different states under different conditions. And yet the accounts share a texture that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence or invention. In a mountain in western Massachusetts, men who entered a 5-mile tunnel reported apparitions carrying picks and lanterns through sections where dozens of workers had died. The railroad's own timetables eventually included a printed warning about the sightings. In a shallow trench outside Philadelphia, blue and green shapes were seen drifting above the ground for nearly 2 centuries. In 2009, a team of researchers followed those sighting reports to a precise location and began digging. What they found underneath was not folklore. It was forensic evidence of mass murder, and along a stretch of track in rural North Carolina, a single flickering light appeared so reliably for so many years that the railroad had to redesign its entire signal system at that station. Not because the light was dangerous, but because it was indistinguishable from a real signal being held by a real man. To understand any of that, you need to understand the rail. The railroad in 19th century America was not built by machines. It was built by hands, by men swinging hammers and setting charges and hauling timber through terrain that had resisted human passage for millennia. The transcontinental lines get the mythology, the golden spike, the photographs, the sweeping western vistas. But some of the most dangerous railroad work in American history happened in the East, in the mountains and valleys and coastal lowlands where the geology fought back and the companies pressed forward anyway. The men who did this work were, overwhelmingly, immigrants. Irish, Italian, Cornish, Chinese. They were paid poorly and housed worse. They slept in shanty camps within walking distance of the job. They ate salt pork and bread and drank water from whatever source was nearest. In the winter, they froze. In the summer, they cooked. The work itself was a catalog of ways to die: cave-ins, premature blasts, gas pockets, floods, equipment failures, falling rock, falling men. And those were just the ordinary dangers, the ones the companies accounted for, the ones that appeared in ledgers and incident reports when reports were filed at all. Tunneling was the worst of it, driving a hole through solid rock mile after mile in near total darkness, breathing air thick with dust and smoke from black powder charges, and later nitroglycerin, which was exponentially more powerful and exponentially less stable. The men worked by candlelight or lantern. They communicated by shouting. When a charge was set, everyone retreated and waited for the blast, and then they went back in before the dust had settled because the foreman was watching and the company was counting days. In those conditions, Folklore did not develop as entertainment. It developed as a parallel record. The official record belonged to the company. It noted tonnage and footage and cost per yard. It did not note what men heard in the dark. It did not note who refused to enter a particular section of tunnel or why. It did not note the objects left at shaft entrances, coins, candle stubs, small crosses made of wire, by men who would have denied leaving them. The Folklore was the workers' record. It held the things that had no column in the company's ledger. If this is the kind of thing you want to see more of, subscribing is the single best way to make that happen. And no piece of railroad infrastructure in American history generated more folklore than a tunnel in the mountains of northwestern Massachusetts. The first account comes from Hoosac Mountain, 1865. The Hoosac Tunnel was supposed to take 4 years to build. It took 24. The project began in 1851 with the simple ambition of connecting the railroad lines of eastern Massachusetts to the trade routes running west through the Berkshire Mountains. Hoosac Mountain stood in the way, a wall of gneiss and schist nearly 5 miles wide. The plan was to bore straight through it. In 1851, that was the most ambitious tunneling project ever attempted in North America. The technology did not exist to do it efficiently. The geology was uncooperative, seams of rock that shifted, pockets of water that flooded work faces, fissures that swallowed drill bits and sometimes men. The project consumed multiple contractors, multiple engineering firms, and eventually required direct intervention by the state of Massachusetts, which took over funding after the private companies went bankrupt. The tunnel was driven from both ends and from a central shaft sunk from the mountaintop down to the planned tunnel grade. That central shaft dropped more than 1,000 feet through solid rock. Water seeped in constantly. The pumps failed regularly. The air at the bottom was bad, hot, heavy, tasting of stone dust and the residue of blasting powder. Men descended on wooden platforms lowered by ropes. They ascended the same way. When the ropes held. More than 200 men died during the construction. That number appears in most historical accounts, though the actual figure was likely higher. Many of the workers were unrecorded. A man could die inside Hoosac Mountain, and his name might never appear in any company document. He would be noted as a loss in the labor count. A number, not a name. The tunnel was known, almost from the beginning, as the Bloody Pit. In March of 1865, a drilling crew was working at the east end of the bore. 3 men, Ringo Kelly, Ned Brinkman, and Billy Nash, were setting a nitroglycerin charge in the rock face. Nitroglycerin had only recently been introduced at Hoosac as a replacement for black powder, and the men were still learning its temperament. The liquid was unstable. It responded to heat, to shock, to friction, to its own mood. Handling it required steady hands and a tolerance for the knowledge that the substance in the can you were carrying could, at any moment, reduce you and everything within 30 feet to a red mist. The procedure was straightforward. Drill a hole, pack the charge, set the fuse, retreat to safe distance, wait for the blast, return, and clear the rubble. Kelly detonated the charge early. Brinkman and Nash were still at the rock face. The explosion buried them under tons of gneiss. There was no possibility of survival. Men came running from the tunnel entrance nearly a mile away. They found Kelly standing in the smoke and dust. He was alive. He was not injured. He could not explain, or would not explain, what had happened. The bodies of Brinkman and Nash were not recovered for days. The rubble had to be cleared by hand carefully because the rock was unstable, and further charges could not be safely placed in the fractured stone. When the bodies were found, they were exactly where they had been standing when the charge went off. The blast had not thrown them. It had buried them in place. Ringo Kelly disappeared. He did not show up for his next shift. He did not return to the shanty camp. He did not collect his pay. His belongings were left behind. The company recorded his absence and moved on. 1 year later, almost to the day, Ringo Kelly was found dead inside the Hoosac Tunnel. His body was at the exact spot where Brinkman and Nash had been buried. There was no obvious cause of death, no wound, no sign of a fall, no indication of gas exposure or crushing injury. He was simply there, in the dark, at the place where the two men he had killed had died. The tunnel was active. Crews were working both ends. No one had seen Kelly enter. No one could explain how he had come to be at that particular point, in that particular section, lying dead with no mark on him. The company's records from 1866 are thin on this point. The death was noted. The cause was not. The coincidence of location was not remarked upon in any official document that has survived. It lived instead in the oral record, passed from crew to crew, shift to shift, in the shanty camps and at the tunnel mouths, growing sharper with each telling. 2 years later, the central shaft became a grave. On October 17, 1867, a fire broke out in the hoisting works at the top of the central shaft. The wooden framework that supported the platforms, the ropes, the pumping machinery, all of it caught and burned. Debris fell down the shaft more than 1,000 feet into the water that had pooled at the bottom. 13 men were working below. The fire burned for days. When it was finally controlled, a crew descended to assess the damage. They found the 13 men. Some had drowned in the rising water, some had suffocated. Some appeared to have died from the initial fall of burning debris. Some had built a makeshift raft from planking and had survived long enough to drift in the flooded shaft before the air gave out. The bodies were brought up. The work continued. It was after the shaft disaster that the sightings began in earnest. Workers approaching the tunnel at dawn reported figures moving in the mist on the mountain above the east portal. The figures carried tools, picks, shovels, lanterns. They moved in the slow, deliberate way of men walking to a shift. They walked toward the tunnel mouth and did not arrive. The mist closed behind them, and they were gone. At first, the reports were scattered. A man on a night shift seeing something he wasn't sure about. A lantern moving along the top of the cut where no one should have been walking. A sound. Boots on gravel, the clink of a pick handle against stone, coming from a section of the tunnel that had been cleared and emptied hours before. The foreman ignored it. Their job was footage per day, charges set, rubble cleared. They did not have a column in their reports for what men saw in the dark. And the men who reported these things did not press the point. They said it once. They were told to get back to work. They got back to work. And they kept seeing things. The accounts grew more specific. Men who did not work the same shifts and did not share shanties described the same figures in the same locations. The east portal, particularly in winter, particularly in fog or light snow. The central shaft area, where the 13 had died. Deep inside the bore, past the second mile, where the air was heaviest and the lanterns burned low, and the dark pressed against the skin like something solid. The figures were described as faint. Not transparent in the storybook sense, more like men seen through heavy smoke. They carried the tools of their trade. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge the living. They walked their routes and vanished. Some accounts described them as trailing a cold that was distinct from the ambient temperature, a cold that moved, that followed, that lingered after the figure was gone. There was no single moment when the workers of Hoosac Tunnel decided collectively that the dead were walking alongside them. It happened the way most workplace knowledge happens, through repetition, through shared experience that accumulates until it becomes assumption. The tunnel was haunted. The dead were in there. You worked anyway. You had no choice. The mortgage or the debt or the family back in Cork or Naples did not care what you saw in the dark, but the sightings were not confined to the workers. In 1872, a doctor named Clifford Owens entered the tunnel. Owens was a skeptic. He was educated, rational, and openly dismissive of the stories circulating through the mountain communities. He intended to walk the bore, observe the conditions, and produce an account that would explain the sightings as the predictable result of bad air, exhaustion, and superstition among uneducated laborers. He entered from the west portal in daylight. He carried a lantern and a notebook. The tunnel was not in active use at the time. Work had paused due to funding disputes. Owens was alone. What Owens reported did not appear in any medical journal. It appeared in a letter and later in local newspaper accounts. He said he had encountered a figure standing in the tunnel approximately 2 miles from the east portal. The figure was motionless. It was not carrying tools. It had no head. Owens did not run. He stood and looked at it. He described the apparition in clinical language. Its borders were indistinct. Its color was pale. It stood at the height and proportions of a man of average build. It did not move toward him. It did not move away. It stood in the center of the bore, in his path, and it had no head. After what Owens estimated was 30 seconds, the figure was no longer there. He did not see it depart. It did not fade or dissolve. It was present, and then it was not. Owens completed his walk. He did not encounter anything else. In his account, he made no effort to explain what he had seen. He noted the conditions, temperature, air quality, his own physical state, and concluded that none of them were sufficient to produce a hallucination of that specificity and duration. He did not claim he had seen a ghost. He stated what he had observed and left the interpretation to others. A man who entered a tunnel to debunk folklore walked out with an account that matched the folklore exactly, and he could not explain it. The tunnel was completed in 1875. The first train passed through on February 9th, 24 years after construction had begun. The bore was 4.75 miles long. It had cost $20 million and more than 200 lives. It immediately became active infrastructure, carrying freight and passenger trains through Hoosac Mountain on a daily schedule. The sightings did not stop. Engineers reported seeing lantern signals inside the tunnel where no one was stationed. Brakemen riding in the last car of freight trains reported seeing figures walking the tracks behind them. Maintenance crews working inside the bore reported hearing voices, not screaming, not groaning, but the low, even murmur of men talking as if a shift crew were gathered just around the curve ahead, discussing the day's work. And then the railroad did something that, more than any individual testimony, validates the persistence of what was being reported inside that tunnel. The Central Railroad of New Jersey, which operated trains through the Hoosac Tunnel, printed a notation in its employee timetables. The timetable was the operational Bible of any railroad, the document that governed every movement of every train on the system. It was not a place for folklore. It was a place for schedules, speeds, signal locations, and operating rules. The notation instructed engineers not to stop for any lantern signals observed inside the Hoosac Tunnel. A railroad is a system built entirely on signals. A lantern signal from a worker on the tracks is a command to stop. Ignoring it risks killing the signalman. The entire culture of railroad operations is built on the principle that signals are obeyed immediately and without question. A railroad does not tell its engineers to ignore signals unless the signals are coming from something other than a living worker. The notation does not explain itself. It does not say why the signals should be ignored. It does not reference ghosts or apparitions or folklore. It simply states the rule: do not stop. That notation appeared in a printed, distributed, company-authorized document. It was not a story told in a bar. It was a policy. The tunnel continued to generate accounts well into the 20th century. The technology changed. Steam gave way to diesel. Lanterns gave way to electric signals. But the reports persisted. And then there was Joseph Impico. Impico worked inside the Hoosac Tunnel in the mid-20th century, maintaining the track and the drainage systems that kept the bore from flooding. He was a railroad worker. He showed up. He did the job. He went home. Impico claimed that voices spoke to him inside the tunnel, not once, repeatedly. Over the course of his working years, the voices warned him of specific immediate dangers: an oncoming train he had not heard, equipment that had been left energized, structural problems in sections he was about to enter. He did not describe the voices as frightening. He described them as helpful. They told him what he needed to know to survive, and then they stopped. He could not see who was speaking. He did not recognize the voices. He listened, and he moved, and he lived. Impico retired, and then he did something no other person connected with the Hoosac Tunnel is known to have done. He went back. Every year, he made a pilgrimage to the tunnel, not to work, not to visit former colleagues, not for any reason he could articulate in practical terms. He went back because the voices told him to. They told him something bad would happen if he stopped coming. He did not elaborate on what that meant. He simply went. every year, a retired railroad worker driving to a tunnel in the Berkshires to stand at the portal and satisfy a condition set by voices only he had heard. He kept going until he couldn't anymore. The Hoosac Tunnel is still in active use today. Freight trains pass through it on the former Boston and Maine line. The bore is essentially unchanged from its 19th century construction. The same stone walls, the same arched ceiling, the same darkness that presses close when the last light from the portal fades behind you. The central shaft is sealed. The drainage systems still carry water out of the mountain. Maintenance workers still enter the tunnel. The railroad does not discuss what they report. That is one tunnel, one mountain, one set of accounts spanning more than 150 years. The dead of Hoosac Mountain, the 200 who built the bore, who bled into its walls, who were buried in its rock and drowned in its shafts, occupy a space in the folklore record that is almost unique in its density and its duration. But the Hoosac Tunnel is not the only piece of railroad infrastructure that left a mark on the men who built and maintained it. And the next account does not come from a mountain. It comes from a shallow trench in Pennsylvania, where 57 men were buried in the summer of 1832. What was found in that trench, 177 years after they were put there, changed the story from folklore to forensic evidence. The lights had been seen above the ground for as long as anyone in the area could remember. The stretch of track near Malvern, Pennsylvania, ran through Chester County, rolling farmland, old-growth hardwoods, stone walls marking property lines that predated the railroad by a century. It was not remote country. It was settled, cultivated, populated land. And yet, along a particular section of the right-of-way, in a shallow depression just south of the tracks where the ground dipped and the drainage collected and the grass grew a shade darker than the surrounding meadow, people saw things. The lights were described consistently as blue-green, not the warm yellow of a lantern or the white of a reflection, a cold light, the color of copper salts burning or of phosphorescence in still water, except there was no water, no copper, no obvious source. The lights moved. They did not drift like swamp gas or flicker like fireflies. They rose from the ground and hovered and moved in patterns that witnesses described awkwardly as purposeful, as if something was walking. The earliest recorded description came from 1832 itself, the same year the 57 men died. A railroad company employee, traveling the line on foot after dark, reported seeing shapes made of colored fire moving above a section of recently disturbed ground. He said they were hopping and bobbing. He said they looked like men. The account was written down and placed in a company file. That file was not made public. It was kept internal, passed between company officers who had reason to know what had happened on that stretch of track and equal reason to ensure no one else did. Because what had happened there was not what the company said had happened. In the summer of 1832, the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad hired a labor contractor named Philip Duffy to supply workers for a difficult stretch of roadbed construction near Malvern. Duffy recruited 57 men. They were Irish immigrants, recently arrived, most of them from County Donegal. They were young. They were desperate for work. They signed on without negotiation because they had no leverage and no alternatives. The work was grading, moving earth, leveling the roadbed, cutting through rises and filling depressions to create the smooth, gradual grade that rail required. It was done with shovels and wheelbarrows and muscle. The men lived in a shanty camp near the work site. They ate what the contractor provided. They drank from the nearest creek. 6 weeks after they arrived, all 57 were dead. The company's official account attributed the deaths to cholera. Cholera was present in the region in 1832. It was plausible. It was convenient. It was the kind of explanation that required no further inquiry. The bodies were buried quickly in a mass trench near the work site. No individual graves were dug. No markers were placed. No names were recorded at the burial site. The company noted the loss of labor and the cost of replacement workers. The trench was covered, the ground was leveled, and the railroad moved on. The 57 men from County Donegal disappeared from the official record as thoroughly as if they had never existed. But they did not disappear from the ground. The lights above the trench were reported intermittently through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. Residents knew the stories. The older families knew what was buried there, or believed they knew. The details had blurred with time, as details do when they are carried by voice rather than by paper. There were Irish laborers, there was a sickness, there was a burial. The ground glowed. The sightings were not dramatic. They were quiet, persistent, and remarkably uniform. Blue-green light, shapes that moved like men. A location that never varied, always above the same shallow depression south of the tracks. People saw them from the road, from their porches, from the windows of passing trains. For nearly 170 years, that was the entire story. Then, in the year 2000, a history professor saw something from his office window. Watson Atkinson was a professor at Immaculata University, whose campus bordered the railroad right-of-way near Malvern. Atkinson had heard the local stories. He had filed them the way academics file things that interest them but do not yet have a frame, as curiosities, as someday projects. What changed was not the folklore. What changed was a construction project. A road-widening effort near the old right-of-way began disturbing ground in the area where the trench was believed to be. Atkinson realized that if the bodies were real, the construction might destroy whatever remained before anyone had a chance to look. He began researching. He pulled railroad company records from the 1830s. He found Philip Duffy's name. He found the labor contracts. He found the cholera explanation, and he found the gaps in it, the speed of the deaths, the manner of the burial, the complete absence of any medical record or quarantine order, which would have been standard practice even in 1832 for a cholera outbreak of that scale. 57 men dead in 6 weeks, and no doctor's name attached to the event. No health officer notified, no adjacent camps warned. Atkinson assembled a team. In 2009, they began excavating. They found the bodies. The remains of the 57 men were exactly where the folklore said they would be, in a shallow trench south of the tracks, in the depression where the grass grew darker and the blue-green lights had been seen for 177 years. The bones were jumbled. They had not been laid out with any care. They had been put in the ground the way you put things in the ground when you want them gone. The forensic analysis took years. When the results came back, they did not confirm the cholera story. They shattered it. Some of the men showed signs consistent with cholera, but others showed evidence of blunt force trauma, fractures to the skull, and long bones that were not consistent with disease or with the normal injuries of railroad labor. Some of the fractures were perimortem. They happened at or near the time of death. The researchers also found evidence of bullet wounds. Not all 57 men had been killed by cholera. Some of them had been beaten. Some of them had been shot. The mass burial, the speed of it, the absence of records, the company's insistence on the cholera explanation, all of it took on a different shape when held against the forensic evidence. This was not only a tragedy, it was, at least in part, a crime. The leading theory was that the deaths were connected to tensions between rival Irish factions, conflict between workers affiliated with different counties or different labor networks, possibly connected to the secret societies that operated within Irish immigrant communities in that period. Philip Duffy may have been involved. The railroad company may have known. The cholera story may have been a cover, a way to explain the loss of 57 men without inviting the kind of inquiry that would reveal what had actually happened in the shanty camp near Malvern. None of this is certain. The forensic evidence establishes that violence occurred. It does not establish who committed it or why. The company records are silent. The contractor's records do not survive. The 57 men left no letters, no journals, no testimony of any kind. They arrived from Donegal. They worked. They died. They were buried in a trench and forgotten by everyone except the people who lived nearby and saw the lights. The excavation team, working the site over multiple seasons, did not report seeing blue-green phenomena above the trench. The forensic work was conducted in daylight, in controlled conditions. No one on the team published any account of anomalous lights, but the residents of the area were asked during the research process about the sightings. Their accounts were consistent with the accounts that had been given for 170 years. Blue-green light, shapes that moved like men, always above the same ground, always at night. The bones of the 57 men were eventually reinterred with proper ceremony. A memorial was erected. The men were given back their names, or as many as the researchers could recover from the fragmentary records of Irish immigration in the 1830s. A mass was said. The ground was blessed. Whether the lights have been seen since the reinterment is not something the published accounts address. The folklore, having done its work, having kept the memory of 57 murdered men alive for nearly 2 centuries when every official record tried to erase them, is left to stand on its own terms. That is what folklore does sometimes. It holds the truth that the official record will not carry. It keeps the dead visible when the living would prefer them buried. The Hoosac Tunnel gave us apparitions that walked the bore for a century and a half, and a railroad company that printed a policy to accommodate them. Duffy's Cut gave us lights above a mass grave that held a secret the official record had been designed to conceal. The last account is different from both. It has no bodies, no tunnel, no forensic evidence. It is only a light, a single, persistent light, and the railroad's slow, institutional admission that it could not make the light go away. The Mako light was first seen in 1867. The story, as it was told along the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad in Brunswick County, North Carolina, was this. A conductor named Joe Baldwin was riding in the rear car of a train approaching the Mako station when the car became uncoupled from the rest of the consist. The train pulled ahead. The car slowed and stopped on the main line. Baldwin knew what this meant. Another train was behind him. It was coming. He had no engine, no way to propel himself off the main track. He grabbed his lantern and went to the rear platform. He swung it back and forth in the Universal Railroad signal for stop. The approaching train did not stop. It came through the dark and hit the uncoupled car, and Joe Baldwin was killed. His head was severed by the impact. His body was found. His head was not. It was never recovered. And then, along the stretch of track near Mako Station, a light began to appear. It looked like a lantern. It swung back and forth, exactly as a man would swing a lantern if he were standing on the tracks, signaling a train to stop. It appeared at the location where Joe Baldwin had died. It appeared regularly, not every night, but often enough that it became a known feature of the landscape, as predictable as the tides. Residents did not remark on it the way outsiders did. It was simply there. The Mako light. You could go see it. People did. The descriptions were consistent across more than a century of sightings. A yellowish or amber light, the size and brightness of a railroad lantern swinging in an arc, sometimes stationary, sometimes moving along the tracks in the manner of a man walking. It behaved in every particular like a lantern being held and swung by a human hand, except there was no human. There was no hand. There was only the light above the tracks in the dark where Joe Baldwin had stood swinging his own lantern in the last seconds of his life. Swamp gas was proposed and largely dismissed. The terrain near Mako was not particularly marshy, and swamp gas does not swing in arcs. Reflected headlights were proposed, but the sightings predated the automobile by decades. The light had been seen in the 1860s and 1870s, when the only light sources in the area were lanterns and candles and the moon. Every explanation failed on the same point. None of them accounted for the light's behavior, its regularity, its location, its precise mimicry of a human signalman's motions. The railroad had a problem. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad relied on lantern signals for its operations. A green lantern meant proceed. A red lantern meant stop. The system was simple and universal. At Mako, it was compromised. Engineers approaching at night could not distinguish the phantom light from a legitimate signal. Stopping for a phantom risked delays. Proceeding through a real signal risked killing the signalman. The railroad solution was to change the protocol. Instead of the standard single lantern system used everywhere else on the line, Mako was assigned a 2-lantern protocol. Any legitimate signal at Mako had to be given with 2 lanterns, held apart. A single light, no matter how convincing, was to be treated as the Mako light and disregarded. This is the second time in this account that a railroad company modified its operational procedures to accommodate something it could not explain. At Hoosac, the instruction was, do not stop. At Mako, the solution was more elaborate, change the entire signal system at one station permanently because one light would not stop appearing. President Grover Cleveland saw it. He was traveling by train through North Carolina when the light was pointed out to him. The account of his reaction is brief and secondhand, but it entered the local record and stayed there. A sitting president, looking out the window of his rail car, saw the Mako light. The light outlasted the steam era. It outlasted the transition to diesel. It outlasted the Atlantic Coastline Railroad itself, which merged into the Seaboard Coastline in 1967 and eventually became part of CSX transportation. The Mako light disappeared in 1977. The tracks through Mako were removed that year. The line was abandoned, the rails pulled up, the ties taken out, the roadbed left to the weeds and the weather. When the tracks were gone, the light stopped appearing. A light that mimicked a railroad signal, that appeared at the spot where a railroad man died, that persisted for 110 years, and that vanished the moment the railroad itself was taken away. As if the light needed the tracks, as if the signal required the infrastructure it was designed to protect, as if Joe Baldwin's lantern, swinging in the dark above a stretch of rail in rural North Carolina, had no purpose once there were no trains left to warn. 3 stretches of track, 3 different states, 3 different eras, and 3 different kinds of evidence. The Hoosac Tunnel gave us a century and a half of apparitions inside a 5-mile bore driven through a mountain at the cost of 200 lives, and a railroad company that put the ghosts in writing in an operational timetable as policy. Duffy's Cut gave us blue-green lights above a shallow grave that kept 57 murdered men visible for 177 years, until the living finally dug them up and confirmed what the folklore had been saying all along. And the Mako light gave us a phenomenon so persistent and so operationally disruptive that a railroad redesigned its signal system at a single station rather than pretend it wasn't there. These accounts exist in different archives, in different states, in different forms: letters, company records, oral histories, newspaper clippings, forensic reports. The men who left them did not know each other. They did not read each other's accounts. They were not building a narrative. They were recording what they experienced, and then they moved on. They went back to work. They filed their reports. They wrote their letters and sealed the envelopes and never mentioned the subject again. The official record of American railroading is written in tonnage and mileage and profit margins. It does not count the men who built the system, not reliably, not completely, not by name. The immigrants who dug the cuts and laid the ties and drilled the tunnels appear in the record as labor costs, line items, numbers that rise when the work is hard and fall when the men die and are replaced. The folklore is the other ledger. It counts what the company would not. It remembers the men who were buried without markers in a trench near Malvern. It remembers the 13 who drowned in the central shaft at Hoosac. It remembers a conductor named Joe Baldwin who stood on the rear platform of an uncoupled car and swung his lantern until the train came through and took his head. It holds these things not because anyone decided they were important, but because the dead insisted, in light, in sound, in figures walking through the mist with picks on their shoulders, on being counted. The Hoosac Tunnel is still there. Trains pass through it every day. The bore smells of sulfur and wet stone and something underneath both of those things that no one has ever been able to name. The central shaft is sealed. The graves on the mountain above the east portal are unmarked. The tracks at Mako are gone. The light has not been seen since 1977. Joe Baldwin's headstone gives his name and his dates. It does not mention the light. The memorial at Duffy's Cut lists the names that could be recovered. Not all 57. Some of them are still missing. Men who crossed an ocean and walked into a shanty camp in Pennsylvania and were never heard from again. The grass still grows darker there. The other record, the workers' record, says otherwise.